This is a great opportunity. I don't personally have a connection to York. As a student, I went to U of T and I studied math. My wife has a master's degree from the FES program and had a great experience here. And as a journalist covering urban affairs, it's really an embarrassment of riches in Toronto because all three major universities have very active and engaged urban affairs departments, and it's good for journalists because we're able to draw on a broad range of people who can talk about with considerable expertise what's going on in the city and help explain to my readers what's going on at City Hall, what's going on with regional planning, and so on. So this is the question I want to explore. I'm gonna throw out more questions than answers because it's not a question with an answer, but it's a question that's intended to provoke some discussion. So, whose duty is it to build the city? Initially, it was the duty of the king or God or some higher authority. I think now we all accept that it's something that we all participate in. A number of the people I spoke to, who are academics and who are city watchers, agreed that this is a phrase, city building, that you hear a lot of. I have access to a humongous database of articles from all the major publications, and I did a search of this phrase, city building initiative, and it turns out that it's used frequently in the context of Toronto. So this is a phrase that's part of our debate about what is the future of Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area, and so we think in those terms. The other related question is, who are our city builders, and is it the duty of the king or some higher authority? Was Jane Jacobs a city builder? I interviewed her parenthetically once, and she scared the hell out of me. Was Robert Moses a city builder? Were they both city builders, or were neither of them city builders? And I think that you can argue both ways. The phrase, as I mentioned, has come up increasingly regularly, and it works its way into the public dialogue about urban planning, regional planning, with very predictable consistency. And I think that coincides with this moment when the demographers told us that more than half the world's population had become urban dwellers. And so that's it was a watershed moment, everybody noted it, and it's a kind of a game-changing proposition because suddenly, the city becomes it's the locus upon which human development is going to play out in the future. It also is a phrase that turns up a lot in planning documents and in planning debates. So the casino proposal, I was on a panel discussion at the Canadian Urban Institute last Friday, and this was a phrase that has become attached to the casino proposal. So whatever else you might think about the casino proposal, the City of Toronto is speaking about the casino proposal and asking residents, as they participate in the casino consultation, to assess whether it's part of a city building initiative. And so this is actually a quote from the casino consultation, and this page goes on to talk about asking people whether the casino proposal satisfies this test of city building, and they have a number of different tests. Does it meet the following objectives: a city of diversity and opportunity, a city of connections, a city of beauty, a city of leaders and stewards? And so this is all sort of laid out in the official plan. Up here across the street in York Region, I found this document. It's a concept that's used to frame very big projects, Langstaff, the Vaughan Metropolitan Centre, which you are going to be intimately connected to once the subway is built. And here are some of the questions that I have. So when we talk about aerotropolis, which is a concept that has been advanced in the past couple of years about urban development, is that city building? And for those of you who aren't familiar with this phrase, this is this notion that that the airport and a sort of an industrial region tethered to the airport that is capable of a lot of fast delivery and manufacturing and quick shipment of goods, that becomes the sort of the central point of a city, and the other services that are necessary for urban development are kind of linked to that. So is that city building? Is city building much smaller? I mean, we hear this concept thrown around a lot, where whether somebody is doing a local community garden or somebody who's doing something very small, very great for their community, they're city builders. This is the convenience store across the street from my house, run by a wonderful elderly Italian couple. They've run it for 45 years. They've walked right off the pages of The Death and Life of the Great American City. They know everything about what's going on in the community. They're the glue that holds my neighborhood together. Are they city builders? In Asia, and I'll confess right now, I'm not a great expert on Asian cities. I mean, there's this enormous amount of investment in the cities that are required to make the Chinese industrial project viable. Some of them are ghost cities. So are these built with city building in mind? Does city building occur as a result of iconic architecture? So, over the last 10 years, we heard a lot about Bilbao and the Guggenheim and its ability to revitalize that, formerly industrial city. Tate Modern has attracted more tourists to London than any other single institution. Is that an agent of city building in the world's greatest city, arguably? So what I've wanted to do with this lecture is to kind of work towards a definition. And so why do you need to define a concept? And so you've all come through academics, and so this is an important idea to sort of define what you're talking about and to be precise. I like to be precise as well, because I think that and I'll talk about this a little later, there's ways of using the phrase properly and ways of using the phrase expediently, and I think that's important to be able to distinguish between the two. So I'm going to throw out some ideas that I've had and that I've sort of solicited from other people about city building. It's not the end of the conversation by any means, but I wanted to sort of offer some suggestions. But first I'm going to tell you what I think it's not. So I think that an individual development is not capable of creating the necessary conditions for what I will describe as city building. Simple infill, starchitecture, just a great, beautiful building in and of itself is not going to do that job. Community building, we talk about city building and community building, I think increasingly interchangeably. Community building is a tremendously important activity in our society, but I think what I'm talking about is more about the hardware rather than the software. And I have a lot of skepticism about whether major events like Olympics and Expos and Pan Am Games, whether they are actually deliver city building goals, or whether that's a sort of a way of sort of justifying the cost. So here's my list. This is my list, and then I'm going to show you some other lists. So I think that the basic ingredient, the flour, the onions that you put at the beginning of a stew, is going to be infrastructure. It's cities are real places, they're physical places, and the infrastructure is the first component. I think that city building projects have to be about more than just what they are. They have to extend into the rest of this urban fabric. They have to connect with it in very significant ways. The goals have to go beyond economic activity. If you have, I go back to the casino, for example, or a very large mall or a cluster of an office residential cluster. Merely the existence of a lot of transactional activity, job creation, I think is necessary but not sufficient. The city building has to be equitable, inclusive. It has to touch people in a way that is not merely transactional. It's not just about a job. It's about something other than that. Placemaking is very important. and I'm going to talk about a bunch of different examples in a moment, but if it's simple, and if it's only one or two agencies or one or two entities, it's not going to do the job. I think that the type of thing that I'm talking about is complicated. It involves many players. It involves governments, multiple agencies, the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, individual citizens. And so when you find something that's, when you find a city building project that's that has delivered something very meaningful, and you find many players involved. I'd like to see, I think that city building ideas have to have an idea that is transferable, scalable, that can be brought from one place to another place. And as a reporter covering urban affairs, I'm always interested in what's going on in other cities. And I think that a lot of people who are involved in urban development and urban planning and thinking about cities, thrive on the cross-pollinization. Why is it that something worked well in one place, and what can we learn from it? And then the last thing is time. The old saying, Rome wasn't built in a day, I think is still a very meaningful observation about cities, and time will tell whether a city building initiative has delivered what it promises. So I spoke to Joe Berridge. For those of you who aren't familiar with Joe Berridge's name, he's the president of Urban Strategies. He's a very experienced planner. He offered many interesting insights. The two that I wanted to add, he talks about, and he actually teaches a course on this at U of T, about city building initiatives at different scales: the regional, the local, and the micro scale. And he makes the point that it's often it often has to do with the major institutions that are the sort of hubs of activity in any big city: airports, universities, business centers, and so on. When he talks about scale, he also talks about innovations that are transformative. And so, two examples: the Oyster card, which was the first, transit card of its sort that has transformed transit, not just in London but in many parts of the world. The Bixi bike example, which started under a different name in Paris, and has transformed the way people get around in cities. Richard Sommer, who's the Dean of the Architecture faculty at U of T, he talks about city building as storytelling, about proposing an alternative future for an urban area. And I think that that's a very powerful idea, and that moves it out of the realm of planning and policy and the sort of minutiae into something that's more, that's even higher than that. And because our cities are collections of stories. Any of you have seen Ed Keenan's latest book about Mayor Ford and in the last couple of years in the city of Toronto. He begins with this idea that a city is just a collection of stories that we tell ourselves. And so we could tell ourselves stories about one future or another future, and ultimately we're talking about building the city. And his example is Daniel Burnham's plan for Chicago. This was a story that ultimately was not told fully, but he had this vision, and then for reasons that have to do with the mechanics of land development and assembly, was not able to make it work. Another set of ideas that I found in a book that recently published by a guy who's a planner and architect at SOM. He offers these 9 principles for 21st century city building. So this is in our era. In the future era, here's the list. It's fairly self-explanatory, and these are strong and powerful ideas, and they often come up in the way that planners will talk about about major projects, and as they should. The other big challenge is that our cities now are so huge, and the numbers of people who live in them are so huge, and the geographic areas are so huge. The city building plays out on a much broader stage, and this is obvious out here at the edge of the old city of Toronto. It's whereas 100 years ago or 200 years ago, individuals like Baron von Haussmann were able to sort of, assert an idea and make it work on an urban stage. This is no longer possible because of the the competing government agencies, the cities that expand over municipal borders that make no sense anymore, just the cost involved. So it's a big canvas. There was a time when city building was a very specific thing, and I take you back to the first slide, Thomas Aquinas' quote. You had the new towns that were the product of one prince, one person building a fort, building walls, filling it with people, and it served a military purpose, a commercial purpose. It was a very contained thing. In more recent North American history, you have William Penn and the Plan for Philadelphia, Pierre L'Enfant and the Plan for Washington. These were politically motivated city building projects. The 1811 Commissioner's Map of New York City. In this case, it grew out of a very specific set of problems, similar to the ones faced in Barcelona, where you had you had old, very crowded, unhealthy areas down at the tip of Manhattan and in the old town of Barcelona that demanded a solution. There was pressure to expand. There was pressure to allow people to live in a less crowded, healthier fashion. In New York's the 1811 Commissioner's Plan, it was primarily driven by the needs of the real estate industry. This was a very simple grid. It was good for land speculators. But it turns out that it was also, conducive to the other kinds of more public-minded amenities that came later in New York, Central Park, for example. The commissioners talked about the importance of a reservoir for fresh water, a public market, and those kind of amenities. It was about transportation, and it was about the ease of movement. So it was about something other than just land speculation and making New York a place where you could invest money. There was a similar motivation by Kasarda, who was interested in dealing with sanitation issues in Barcelona at the time, and so this is why that street grid was built. So I just want to talk a little bit about Toronto's preeminent city builder. R.C. Harris was born in North York, Lansing in 1875. He actually grew up. His mother was a cleaner at Old City Hall, and he grew up sort of riding his bike around the corridors of City Hall. Went on to become an office boy. He worked for one of the newspapers for a while, and then ended up working for City Hall in increasingly important positions, and eventually was made the Commissioner of Properties in 1909, I believe, and then was made the Works Commissioner in 1912. He was just a centenary. The centenary of his appointment took place fairly recently. He belonged to the progressive movement. He believed in rational municipal government. He believed in the importance of using public infrastructure to accomplish certain goals. Cleaning there were big problems with water shortages, with water contamination at the time. He was also a believer in the use of distinctive architecture for public infrastructure as a way of marking the public space and of elevating the importance of what the city was doing in terms of its own growth. And so the R.C. Harris water filtration plant, which was built in the 1930s, is the most spectacular example of this, where he employed most striking architectural elements in what is basically a functional operation, a water purification plant. But the goal was to heighten the role, to demonstrate to the public that clean water is is indistinguishable from urban growth, and it was built with public tours in mind. He had similar ideas about the bridges that he built in the city, and he was unlike the commissioners and Serda, he did not create a street grid for Toronto because that existed already, but he did create a number of extensions of streets that were built to allow the growth of the city. He built hundreds and hundreds of miles of sidewalks in Toronto, and so he is really the architect of the old city of Toronto, which that was built up into the pre-war period, which is a dense, relatively dense city. It's good for streetcars, and so he in my mind fits the notion of what a city builder is and what city building is, because he created the hardware, the stage upon which the city could grow in the future. So I just wanted to run through a couple of much more contemporary examples. This is one that I think is a really interesting example. For years and years, these very steep slopes in many South American cities and also elsewhere in the world accumulated, these enormous illegal squatter populations. A couple of years ago, the municipality put in this outdoor escalator to augment what they'd done a couple of years earlier, which was an outdoor gondola, to help people get up and down the slope. And I think that this is, to my mind, a great example of city building, because it for one thing, it's connecting the official city with the unofficial city. It's about infrastructure, but in a very interesting kind of targeted type of infrastructure. More recently, we have the example of the car-free zones in cities like New York and Copenhagen, and this is the work of some Danish planners, some American city planners, and this is city building of a different sort. Where it's about reclaiming urban spaces for non-vehicular use, and I think it's a very powerful idea. We see it spreading all over the world. Began with the Sojet and the Stroget in Copenhagen. Other interesting examples, and we obviously have the Bring Back the Dawn movement here. On your left, this used to be a culvert with a highway on top of it, and the mayor of Seoul, who's now the president of South Korea, made a big deal out of removing the highway, urbanizing the river. Similarly, in San Antonio, Texas, this was also a culvert. It was very polluted. It was it was a blight in the downtown, and the downtown was dying. A group of citizens came together, eventually got the city on board to bring back this bit of the San Antonio River. The ciclovias, another idea that has spread from across Central America or South America. There are ciclovias in Winnipeg and Los Angeles. There's one being discussed here. This is again a reconsideration of how roads are used. Wunurf, I think I'm mispronouncing it, but this whole notion that again the street can be shared by multiple types of users. I'm going to give you a controversial example, but I think one that is worth mentioning: Canary Wharf. When it was initially developed in the 80s, there wasn't sufficient funding for transit connections out to Canary Wharf, and that led to some of the bankruptcies that occurred. Subsequently, we saw the development of the Docklands Light Rail, the Jubilee line that was extended out there, the development of more of a mixed-use kind of environment. And so Canary Wharf now becomes sort of a platform for which London can grow east, and I think that it represents an example of how over time certain problems that were apparent at the beginning were subsequently solved and created something that's a very powerful part of London. So I'll just quickly run through some of these. These are familiar to you. This is the 1912 Harbour Commission plan, which created the Portlands. This was when it was first bruited, absolutely bona fide example of a city building objective. This was all going to be infill. That was the Ashbridges Bay swamp, as they were known then. Now it would be called a wetland. And it was a very contaminated place because the city dumped a lot of sewage there. There was a big land reclamation area, and it was going to become this kind of industrial sort of anchor for the city, and it took a couple decades to build it, by which time the St. Lawrence Seaway had been completed and the Toronto port was rendered sort of unnecessary and has been ever since. So if you could speed up Toronto's growth from the 1960s to the present, you would see this tremendous, incredible amount of investment that took place in the downtown core, which was the result of planning decisions that were made in the 1970s that were controversial, led to a whole political reform movement, but created this highly integrated area connected by the path system, which I think is an interesting piece of city building unto itself, that functions as something more than just an office district, in my view. It's very much like a focal point of the city's economic life, the country's economic life, and it therefore qualifies as going beyond itself. St. Lawrence, image on the right shows all the parking lots that were created with the demolitions in the 60s for urban revitalization that was ultimately changed. We saw St. Lawrence developed, and it has grown eastward as an idea of mixed-use housing of a certain size and form, and it's an idea that continues to move east. If you could stand back and look at Toronto in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, you could not help but conclude that Union Station is this heart that really is incredibly important to the functioning of the city. How we got from that moment in the 60s when it was almost knocked down to where we are now, where it's the subject of hundreds of millions of dollars of reinvestment, and it's become a conduit to this whole development south of the railway tracks, is an interesting story that had many, many players, and at no point was the current outcome preordained. There were many moments when bad decisions could have been made and were averted. And so I think that it's an interesting example of how, of the complexity part of it, because there's so many entities. Even the acquisition of the Union Station from the old railway company that owned the land was unbelievably complicated, but gave rise to subsequent redevelopment efforts that we see ongoing. And it will be an increasingly important part of the city because it draws people into the downtown core and creates this sort of critical mass that exists in the downtown. I talked about preordained a moment ago. I think that much of the railway lands redevelopment is an example of a missed opportunity with city building. There were better plans, there were more successful, that would have become more successfully integrated into what Toronto is than what has been built. The city place, I think, will be a regrettable decision in its current urban form. It's very isolated. It's a monoculture. It's isolated on both sides, and its public spaces leave much to be desired. So there were previous plans that had more amenities, that had a different type of form. And I think that it's an example of how the city lost control over a process because we have the Ontario Municipal Board, we have a very diffuse decision-making system that makes it difficult to sort of bring certain planning visions to fruition, and this is an example of one of those. The Mississauga City Centre, I include this because my in-laws live in Buffalo, and I've been driving to Buffalo along the 403 about 5 times a year for the last 25 years. And it's really interesting to watch Mississauga city center evolve, and you really can tell. This is the picture on the right is the left is a great picture. You can see it was like surrounded by farms, and it was this just very ordinary mall. It still today lacks many of the amenities of a dense urban core, but it's a kind of a frontier land, I think, and it's a big experiment in trying to create density around a shopping mall, and it seems to be working. And I would predict that generations hence you'll see a lot less of that parking, a lot more of the density as that mall is slowly absorbed into the urban fabric. I want to talk a little bit about Regent's Park because I've been doing a bunch of reporting on this, and I think that Regent's Park is really a wonderful example of city building at the moment, and in Toronto, and one that I think that we can learn a lot from. It was built in the 40s and 50s with federal money. It became, a very problematic area, lots of crime, very concentrated poverty. The urban form was conducive to crime because there were these cul-de-sacs, there were lots of blind spaces. After amalgamation, the different housing companies were merged. Toronto Community Housing emerged and came up with this formula in the early 2000s that basically went like this: that you intensify the land by developing market condos and using the cross-subsidizing the redevelopment of the affordable housing, and build it in such a way as to integrate it into the rest of the city. So if you look at the planning maps of Regent's Park now, you see that it's picked up on the grid structure that is very typical of the old downtown. One of the most interesting ones as a city building project, which will officially play out for the next 10 years, but will go on for much longer, is the Eglinton Crosstown, which is the most significant transit project that the city has seen since the young Bloor lines were built in the 50s and 60s. It's an enormous project. Crosstown is an appropriate name for it because it really it goes through every different type of part of the city. It's almost archaeological because you see the traditional suburban forms in the Golden Mile. You see the sort of post-war suburbs around Don Mills. You see the old city of Toronto. You have the very working class areas in the west of the Allen. And so the question is, how do you pull that together and make it something more than just a transit route? Or should it be more than just a transit route? And I think this is an interesting question. This guy here, Antoine Grumbach, has been hired by the city and Metrolinx to kind of come up with some thinking about this. He's a very well-known planner from France, and I spoke to him about this this lecture and his story. So he's talking about how do you think differently about a project that big. And so the tunneling and the actual building of the tracks will take place over 10 years. But how do you use that to leverage something more along that line to create city or to create a different type of city, especially in areas like Scarborough where this line will run through very traditional low density, big footprint lots. And so his thinking is that he wants to work with the geography, the physical nature of that line, because it's got a lot of hills and it does go over quite a hilly terrain, and look at different ways of integrating transit construction and development. I mean, traditionally what we do, and as you know from the subway out here, you build the whole, you do all of the engineering stuff, and then afterwards you fill everything in, and then you start thinking about the development part. But maybe it should be done at the same time. Maybe there are ways of pulling all of those components together, including the including citizens and local residents in that whole process. So you're not just building a station, but you're building around a station, and you're rethinking the area around each individual station. So this is what he's thinking about. The results are not predetermined. There was a decision to put the Spadina subway up the middle of the Allen Road, which was the wrong decision. The original, some people wanted it to run up Bathurst, and we would have had a different city, a different Bathurst if it had done that. Sheppard, the subway to nowhere, it's still very empty, and you know, maybe it will become something other than itself if we could all come back in 100 years. You know, maybe Sheppard will have realized the Mel Lastman's vision, but as it stands, it's a very difficult. You know, it was infrastructure put in the wrong spot. Richard Sommer told me about the example of the Big Dig in Boston, which was the world's most expensive infrastructure project. It consumed $22 or $23 billion. It was a melodrama that ran over, I think, almost a decade and a half to replace the big central artery here, and to sort of to bury it in a sense. Sommer was working at the Harvard Graduate Design School at the time, and did a significant land use study on what could have been done with the area that was liberated by this project. Much of what it replaced were sort of public squares, public open space, nicely landscaped and so on. But in his analysis, the city and the region failed to sort of see this large infrastructure project as a way of leveraging other investment and to rebuild, you know, into the downtown core, to develop in a way that addressed constituencies that existed outside downtown Boston, and to really kind of reconnect parts of the city that had been separated by this massive highway. So that was a missed opportunity. And this is the whole discussion about the hubbarbs and the mobility hub studies. So as part of Metrolinx's Big Move plan, it's identified a number of nodes around Greater Toronto which will be sort of major transit nodes, and they'll see ideally two-way, all-day go service. You know, they'll function as sort of the hub in a hub and spoke kind of local transit mode. You'll have this network of interconnected places around this very large geographical area. And so what happens in these spaces? What happens, you know, in Cooksville, at Mississauga Center? Is the infrastructure capable of leveraging and bringing about genuine city building? So this is an idea that has been put forward for Oakville, for the GO station, the area around the GO station in Oakville. In many cases, these hubs exist at GO parking lots, and they're very large. And how do you turn a parking lot into a piece of city? And this is a challenge that has been taken up in Vancouver with the SkyTrain stations, but it turns out to be a really difficult problem, and it's a city building problem because again, it's as with the Vaughan Metro Center. How do you create something that's more than itself, that has gravity, that has the ability to sort of refocus those cities, these suburban areas? For me, one of the most interesting projects and in the city's recent history, when in the first term of Mel Lastman, the old Toronto General building, the very first wing of the Toronto General, was going to be decommissioned, and there was a proposal to make it into condos. And John Evans and a couple of other people associated with the University of Toronto intervened and said, why don't we create this, you know, this sort of this cluster, this innovation cluster? And so the Mars Discovery District was born. It has this amazing proximity to the hospitals in downtown Toronto. This is, I think, in a funny way, a prototype for what Michael Bloomberg is talking about for New York, which I think is a fascinating and game-changing idea. And for those of you who don't know, he he proposed the following. He was going to put up $100 million of city money and some parcels of land and put out an RFP asking for universities and other research institutions to come up with proposals for an applied sciences center. On the other side of the equation, we have the impact of climate change. And so this is Finch Avenue, this is Sandy after, or this is New York after Sandy. And so the changes in the climate and the impact on cities may create a new type of city building, one that requires a defensive pose and some significant infrastructure to defend the city as it exists. And so this is the flood barrier, the Thames barrier. There are similar ones in other cities. So I'll just close with this sentiment, which is self-evident to anybody who likes to watch cities. And you never finish a city, but I've finished my lecture, and I open the floor to questions, and thank you for your time.